Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I'm Rick Hasen of UCLA School of Law and the Safeguarding Democracy Project. Welcome to our forum today on AI social media and the 2024 elections. This is our seventh event in the last 6 weeks, I think, where we've been dealing with issues related to the upcoming elections. All of our events have been recorded, and you can find links to the recordings of those events at the Safeguarding Democracy Project website, which is safeguardingdemocracyproject.org. Today, I'm going to introduce our panelists. I'll be asking them questions, but you can also submit questions. If you'd like to submit questions, you can use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. So today we're fortunate to be joined by three leaders thinking about issues at the intersection of law, politics, and technology. We have Kate Klonick of St. John. She teaches property, internet law, and a seminar on information privacy. Her research focuses on law and technology, most recently on private platform governance of online speech. Her full bio is being put in the chat. Suffice to say that if I spend time reading our speakers' bios today, we'd run out of time because they are all so accomplished, and really we're very fortunate to have them. Brendan Nyhan is the James O. Friedman Presidential Professor in the Department of Government at Dartmouth College. His research focuses on misperceptions about politics and healthcare. Again, his full bio is worth reading, and it is linked in the chat. And our good friend Nate Persily is the James B. McClatchy Professor of Law at Stanford Law School, with appointments in the Department of Political Science, Communication, and the Freeman Spogli Institute of International Studies. He is also the founding co-director of the Stanford Cyber Policy Center and its program on democracy and the internet, as well as the Stanford MIT Healthy Elections Project. Sounds not that healthy for you getting enough sleep, Nate, with all of those things. Again, the full bios are in there. Okay, so now we can turn to some substance. And, we've been seeing lots of stories coming for the last few years about this was going to be the AI election. Everything was going to change. And, last election, we were in the middle of the pandemic. People were stuck to their computers, looking at social media all day. And so I want to open up with the same question, and I'll go in the order in which the boxes appear on my screen, which will be Nate, Brendan, and Kate. And I'm going to ask you the same question. If you could just address each for a few minutes. What do you see as the most salient differences in the political information environment between 2020 and 2024? How have things changed? What are we looking at that looks different? And Nate, let's start with you.
Well, I think there are significant changes. I actually think AI is the least of it, but one cannot overstate the importance of what's happened at Twitter, now X, to the sort of information ecosystem, and especially as it relates to elections. So the changes that have been made at Twitter, X, have sort of expanded the Overton window as to what is permissible content moderation. And beyond that, it's had a kind of knock-on effect at the other platforms, most of which are not not doing as much moderation as they had previously. A lot of the election teams have been downsized. It's not true across the board, but it's true at some of the most important platforms. And so that, I think, is really quite important. And then secondly, one of the changes, particularly at Facebook, is the Meta and all their products, is the move toward demoting or politically salient information, journalism, that type of thing, and rewarding and ranking non-political, non-journalistic information, friends and family content. And so they've kind of thrown up their hands and said, look, we've gotten in so much trouble with respect to moderating disinformation. One way to deal with this is to try to have less journalism, less election-related content in people's feeds. And so those are sort of two of the big developments that I'd highlight. I'd also point out, that there are positive things that the platforms did in the 2020 election, perhaps because of the emergency of the pandemic in terms of voting information, that are not as at such a great scale this time, in part because I think there's concern, that it may be partisan. And so all of the backlash that happened after 2020, I think, is being felt throughout the kind of chain of command at these companies. Some of it is because of the political pressure, which is well known to all of us, but also mistakes that they made, like with respect to the Hunter Biden laptop, has really chastened their efforts to try to be more regulatory, more moderating in the content on their platforms.
Thank you. Brendan.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Rick. So I want to comment on some of the same points as Nate, but maybe add a bit more on each of them. The first, and actually, Rick, I think you mentioned the AI point at the beginning, and I do want to start with that because there was so much attention to that point in the run-up to this election. People like me have said again and again, we should worry about chasing the new shiny objects, and we risk neglecting the more important sources of misinformation. Principally Donald Trump, a figure who has no equal in contemporary American political history as a source of misinformation, and of course has a vast platform, and his every utterance is broadcast often through the mainstream media to reach people. AI, to the extent it has played a role in this election, it's been relatively minimal, and it's been as a kind of meme generator. There's a kind of partisan chum function to a lot of the AI content that circulates online. Someone says Kamala Harris is a communist, and they make up a AI generated image of her in communist regalia, and Elon Musk retweets it. That's not nothing, but it's not a first order concern in terms of the threats to democracy that we face right now. So I think the folks who thought that this was the most important threat facing our democracy, those fears have not come to pass. Doesn't mean it's not an important issue or one we should consider, but I think we should be more circumspect about the attention it receives relative to the more mundane source of threat. And I say mundane, with irony, because of course they are not mundane. The threats to democracy are unfortunately very real, but we appear to get bored with them very quickly and focus on other kinds of risks and issues instead. The second point, in terms of the de-emphasis the reduced focus on politics on social media, I just want to offer two comments about that point that Nate raised. The first is that was essentially the result of a calculated operation to disincentivize platforms from engaging in content moderation. The political blowback on that to Meta principally was a kind of political op. The House committee and their allies have put enough pressure on Meta that they are now aggressively downranking politics on their platforms. Elon Musk lit billions of dollars on fire to buy Twitter and tear those guardrails down. So between those two actions, we have a really different informational landscape. And I guess the thing I'll say about that is I just want to make clear why those events took place, but also note, to the contrary, that the world hasn't ended. Our democracy is certainly not in a good place, but I think the kinds of stories that we often heard in the aftermath of 2016 and 2020 about how online misinformation, social media misinformation was why our democracy was under threat, I don't think the events of this cycle are consistent with that kind of a story. On the one hand, Meta's aggressively downranking all politics. On the other hand, Elon Musk is letting his freak flag fly and anything goes on his platform. In terms of the risk facing American democracy, I don't think either is at the top of the list. And again, I'll just come back last to, Donald Trump is the story here. How he is covered is in some ways the central issue. And the things he says, right, are the central source of misinformation. How he's covered is a central issue in how misinformation is treated in our politics.
I've got a lot of follow-up questions to that, but before I come back to you, let me turn to Kate and bring her into the conversation.
Hi, thanks for having me. So I agree with a lot of what Brendan and Nate said. I think that this is AI is playing much less of a role than everyone anticipated. I think there was a lot of hype. I think there still is a lot of hype around AI, in particular about kind of the damage that it will directly do to, you know, to this election and future elections. But what I do think is kind of no pun intended, but a meta point about AI is the fact that AI's existence in the ecosphere has really changed the amount that people trust the media that they consume, the stories that they read, their general ability to like discern or to know whether what they're seeing is real or not. And so I think that has been a huge sea change in the information ecosystem between 2020 and 2024. Although, like Brendan, I kind of think that this has not actually been kind of the sky is falling future that everyone was kind of predicting. And I want to go back to but I do want to take a little bit of umbrage with the Elon Musk thing and like the Twitter's takeover, because I do think that actually has had long-term knock-on effects. And this is in agreement more with Nate than it was with Brendan, which is just essentially that I think the Twitter's takeover by Elon Musk was the beginning of what I wrote about once. It was called I call it the end of the golden age of content moderation, which was like these these content moderation efforts by social media platforms, the content moderation that they put into the business, into deciding what comes up or comes down, is a huge cost center for their business. And for a long time, they were doing that because they thought that there was a reputational need to do it. They thought it protected advertising. They thought that all of these things were necessary. The regulation was going to come down on them if they didn't do this. And, you know, to a really, I think, damaging degree, Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter showed us that that really wasn't that necessary. You could really completely slash and burn your entire content moderation team and efforts. And, you know, well, we don't know yet or how long this will last, but that you could basically keep operating in some type of effect. The platform would drastically change. Maybe people wouldn't use it as much. It would be taken over by bots. Advertisers might flee. But it did seem to kind of give this signal that I think is really damaging and shows us how thin the norms were that were kind of keeping us along this kind of good content moderation or private governance efforts that were happening a lot of us were trying to get the companies to do. And so I think that that was actually quite damaging, not just to the environment of Twitter, whether you get your news there or not, or spend a lot of time on there or not. I think that it had knock-on effects about how other platforms saw their investment in the cost centers of their business, and that has had a massive kind of waterfall effect on everyone's how everyone's running their content moderation and private governance now.
So, I mean, I'm sensing a theme here, those who are saying, lighting their hair on fire is we're not seeing that. But it sounds like, I mean, you could tell, let me put it this way. I'll start here with you, Kate. You tell an optimistic story from what you're all saying, which is that people have become more chastened or discerning. And so then they're kind of discounting the misinformation, and maybe they're encountering less of it because Meta is downgrading it on the platform. But if you downgrade all information and discount what you see, it means that voters might be having trouble getting true information as well. And so I just wonder how much of a good news story is it to say we got rid of the trust and safety teams at these places, and democracy is still standing, at least for now.
Oh, that was my bad news story. Sorry if that wasn't clear. I thought that was terrible. That I think is I really think that this is, I think, from a very kind of classical First Amendment Michelsonian sense, my entire argument is that good governance is actually essential to kind of the First Amendment and free speech environment. You need to create organization and governance or some rules to rule a private public space, or you're just not going, and it's just going to be a free for all, and it's not going to be a useful information ecosystem. And so investing in trust and safety teams, investing in good private governance, and making that transparent, making that reactive to the people that use the site, and not just to the whims of billionaires. Those are things I've argued for a long time, and I think that are established as kind of best practices worldwide for these platforms. And that's what I think we've lost in kind of this game of chicken, where now where we've had like someone say, well, what are you going to do what are you going to do, world, governments, people, generally, if I just destroy the platform that you love, that you now rely on for information? You can't make me run it this way or that way or another way. And that's exactly what we're seeing. And so like what you're also seeing is like, why would Meta decide in what I still think is a competitive environment for a lot of these platforms between TikTok and Meta and YouTube and everything else, that why would they decide that they're going to keep investing billions of dollars in a cost center that, like, basically, someone else just ran a trial balloon and showed us we don't need that. It's really not that necessary towards getting the job done or appeasing regulators or appeasing users, or really like, advertisers will still come. And so like, that's kind of my worst case scenario, actually. And so that I'm quite negative about. Whether or not it is impacted, I think you're completely right. And I think that actually the politics part that Brendan talked about, the pullback from Meta and the reaction to like, we'll just throttle anything that's political, is the downside of all of this.
I want to turn first to Brendan about what we know about the volume and about what we know about controlling misinformation, before I turn to Nate on like legal strategies. What about laws rather than relying on self-policing? So Brendan, like one of the stories of 2020 that I was following very closely was labeling. It's like, are they going to slap a warning label on a Trump tweet? And then, I've seen here and there, although I don't keep up with the literature the way you do, maybe these things are counterproductive. Maybe these things don't work. Maybe they actually signal, the liberal media is calling out the truth or whatever. So we're like, what do we know now about, the volume of deliberate false information, related to elections? And what do we know about strategies for dealing with it that we didn't know 4 years ago?
Yeah, it's an important question. I would say, there's still a lot that we don't know about how things work in practice on platforms. That has been a question that since the political backlash began in the aftermath of 2016, the platforms have gotten very quiet about. I am part of the group of academics who are partnering independently with Meta on a series of evaluations that continue of their involvement in the 2020 election. So I think we, as a group, hope to have more to say about this subject going forward. But I'll summarize the research that's out there now. What I think is the most important takeaway from all the research that's been done. So there's been a flood of new research since 2016. A lot of it has been coming out, especially since 2020. And I'm going to put a link in the chat for Ben to share if he chooses, to the piece that we wrote. What I think that the behavioral data tell us in general, that my co-authors and I described in this Nature Perspectives article, is a pattern where exposure to potentially harmful online misinformation is far more concentrated than we previously assumed. There's been a lot of worry about the kind of average person falling down rabbit holes and the median voter having their vote preference changed by online misinformation. But when you look at actual digital behavioral data, which a number of studies have now done across a variety of platforms and a variety of time periods and contexts, at least in the US, where we have the best data, we have seen a consistent pattern of very small slices of the population consuming the vast majority of those types of harmful content, whether it's so-called fake news on Twitter, untrustworthy websites in your browser, alternative and extremist channels on YouTube. Again and again, we see the same kind of pattern. And I think it really reframes the question, because what you're often thinking about in these cases is not, how can I kind of protect average internet user X from falling down this supposed rabbit hole to extremism. And it's instead thinking about, how can we mitigate the harms these platforms can create for people who already have very strong predispositions to seek this kind of content out, and who may be their minds may not be changed by it because they often have strong pre-existing attitudes to begin with. So for instance, the consumers of these alternative and extremist channels that my co-authors and I studied on YouTube had very negative gender and racial attitudes already, right? So it's unclear that those channels are changing their mind in some fundamental way, but that kind of content might be activating them to take some action in the world that could create important online or offline harms beyond just a mere act of consumption. In cases like that, I don't think labeling is going to be an especially effective strategy. Those people are seeking this kind of content out. We see, for instance, on YouTube, there are typically people who subscribe to these channels or ones like them. They're following accounts. They're opting into these streams of information. So it's important to have strategies like labels, but I think there's a deeper, more fundamental question about whether platforms should be essentially facilitating building audiences of this kind. I think they're very hard questions for democracy about someone like Donald Trump and deplatforming. Rick's written a lot about that, and I think he's right that we should really grapple with those kinds of questions. They're profound ones. I don't have the same misgivings, though, about a lot of the purveyors of this kind of content who are often trying to get famous or make money. I don't think they have any right to be amplified by YouTube or to have its audience aggregation and platform functionality and video storage capabilities offered to them for free to help them reach tens, hundreds, or thousands, millions of people with extremist content. So I guess to me, that's really the thing that we've learned the most about. And it's a really hard, challenging problem because it's not simply a matter of stopping these well-intentioned people from falling down rabbit holes, but it's about this more difficult question that there are people with extreme attitudes and preferences among us, and these kinds of platforms can really facilitate them coming together around potentially harmful content. And how we manage that is, I think, the most important question going forward.
Before I come to Nate, let me just follow up quickly and ask about the pandemic. Was that like cause a lasting change in terms of people's onlineness and willingness to go down rabbit holes, or do we not know? Or has there been a rebound into real life for people?
I don't know of a good study on that. That's a great question. Okay. Those of my fellow colleagues in the research world, I hope you are writing that down.
I'm happy to give you a research agenda that you or someone else can do. Okay, Nate, let's come back to you. And I want to ask you about the legal environment. You know, we've heard a lot about kind of self-regulation, like what should YouTube do? What is Meta doing? We could say the market will sort it all out. You know, advertisers are leaving from X and, you know, the subscription model is being put in, and, you know, we'll see how that goes. But the alternative is regulation. We're not seeing a lot of regulation coming from the federal government, but states have tried. So, you know, you've got the conservative states that are kind of having must-carry provisions for politicians, Florida and Texas. You've got California purporting to ban deepfakes. What's the landscape? Where's the First Amendment fit in? What does it all look like in the United States? And then maybe I'll come to Kate for a comparative perspective afterwards, thinking about Europe and other places.
All right, before I answer that question, let me just build a little bit on what Brendan was saying, which is that, and maybe this is a dissenting view in our field generally, which is that I don't even know what it would mean to police disinformation in this environment right now. I mean, it is so much a part of the campaign that it's like, it's not only about political bias at this point, it's like the main divisions between the parties right now are questions of fact, right? And so when you have like a central question like whether the 2020 election was legitimate or not, I don't even know what it, I mean, I think it's a lot to ask of the platforms, and I'm not saying, Brendan, you were suggesting this, a lot to ask of the platforms to actually actively monitor that, because not only are they obviously taking sides, but it's like the political system is just like, it's hardwired right now that is so embedded in all of the conversations about politics, and it's literally part of the campaigns that I almost don't even know what to do about it. Now let's talk about regulation. So, yeah, you already mentioned some of the salient developments. So you had the net choice cases that went to the Supreme Court, so that those laws which required the platforms to carry, you know, basically to carry certain types of content that they otherwise might moderate, that was in a preliminary stage, basically rejected by a majority of the Supreme Court. We don't have to get into the kind of weird procedural posture, but it looks like there's certainly a majority that says you can't force the platforms to carry, hate speech or other kinds of content they deem harmful. So that's one thing. But at the same time, we have this Third Circuit case that just came down in the last few months, which is going to potentially hold the platforms liable for certain types of content. In that case, TikTok is alleged to, because its algorithm was alleged to amplify self-harm content for kids, that they're opening the possibility that they would be held liable. So, and we had always thought that Section 230, which is sort of the famous law that immunizes platforms from liability, would cover a situation like that, so that their algorithms, they couldn't be sort of independently held liable for amplification of dangerous content. One thing I want to say, just as a larger point here, which is that I think there is a difference between political misinformation in general and then harmful content that could, say, impose liability on the other. And we need, especially when people talk about legal reforms related to Section 230, we need to kind of distinguish those, because Section 230 has become this kind of metaphor for the way we talk about the entire legal landscape related to platforms, when it's really a particular type of law that immunizes them from things like defamation or actual harm in the real world that they might commit, as opposed to what most people think 230 is about. Well, it's if not for 230, they might moderate disinformation generally, or they might moderate hate speech. Those are actually separate issues that I think people end up confusing. But one thing I want to, just to tie it back to the AI conversation a little bit, and then I'll turn it over to Kate to talk about maybe Europe and some other places. One of the interesting things that I think is happening because of the importance of AI in people's feeds now, as well as in search results, is that the AI generated content that the platforms themselves are generating, whether it's through search results that then lead to summaries, or Meta has now said they're going to generate AI content in people's feeds, the platforms will be liable for that, right? So that if there's defamation, or if there's other kinds of injury that occurs as a result of that, that is not going to be shielded by 230 immunity. And so that's something that as we think about the future here, something that could actually end up in court.
Can you, just before I turn to Kate, talk about the California deepfakes law? And
Yeah,
that was a liberal state doing something related, as opposed to the two conservative states that were acting in the net choice cases.
Well, all right. So the three areas where you see real action at the state level are on synthetic imagery, children, and privacy to some extent. And so let's just talk about, well, the first two. The deepfake disclosure law that's passed in California, there's, as you know, since I think you posted about this, Rick, there's a requirement of disclosure of the use of synthetic imagery, but there's an exception for satire and some other exceptions. And I think there is a constitutional way to require disclosure for AI-generated imagery. And many states, I think as many as a third of states, may have passed something related to this in the last year or so. Might be fewer than that. And so in California, this is the issue is being tied up in court with respect to particular AI-generated satire. And from my conversations with folks at the platforms, this is where they see the kind of envelope being pressed. And this is consistent with what Brendan said at the beginning, which is that so much of the AI-generated content is almost like entertainment, satire, exaggeration. And they are saying, well, no one would really believe that this is not AI-generated. But I think an attempt to require disclosure for AI-generated content is probably constitutional. Although one thing we should realize is that over time, it's going to be increasingly difficult to watermark this kind of content and to have the reliability that people hope we'll have.
Let me remind everyone before I turn back to Kate that if you have questions, you can type them in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Kate, so we don't In the United States, we don't tend to look too much at what's happening in the rest of the world, but the rest of the world is dealing with the consequences of American companies that are, providing this service to people around the world to be able to spread disinformation. Are they doing it better in Europe or elsewhere?
I don't know what you mean by better. Are they doing?
Well, you weren't happy with how the United States, how things are going here.
Yeah. So just to kind of like let the audience know why I'm getting this question, even though I'm a U.S. scholar and an American, is that essentially I have been in Europe and particularly in Paris, following the rollout of a bunch of internet regulation, the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, which are two very, very large, very comprehensive bills or laws that were passed in the EU to govern content online and how social media platforms in particular, or platforms generally, decided what could stay up and come down and what kind of rights users had. And that has been a fascinating experience. I've been here for the last like 18 months about. And I think that the main thing that I've taken away is that, I hate to say it, but there's not so much. I mean, it's going to be a while before we see how all of these laws are enacted in every member state, for one. Two, I think it's going to be a while before the norms set in. There just simply is not these laws call for a lot of infrastructure, a lot of intermediary bodies that just simply don't exist yet, that need to be set up. And people have to to create them and fund them, and it can't all come from the companies, and there isn't the type of civil society rather, kind of environment here and foundation funding to kind of fund these types of these endeavors. And so there's a lot of questions about how all of this is going to work at the end of the day. So like the theory of it, I suppose, if you are one who thinks that regulation is the right way to go about it, like if you think regulation just kind of writ large is like the better way to kind of go about solving a lot of these problems, then I guess like you would think that the DSA and the DMA are good solutions. But I do think that also you have to kind of understand that it's kind of politics all the way down, and that it's markets all the way down, even in places that supposedly hate markets, like or don't trust markets, like Europe. And I say that just mostly because they are creating one of the things that I've been learning and been steeped in here is how much Europe is kind of being protectionist in creating this legislation, how they are both courting AI like so much, like want this to be the next kind of break them out of their failure to innovate in tech over the last 20 years. They want AI to be different. They have a few really like notable kind of people and companies that have come out of Europe. They really want these to be like sea change moments, but yet they are still threatening regulation, and it's still scaring businesses away and making it so that they don't want to kind of begin nascent industries here. Yet Europe for the last 5 or 6 years has kind of decided that they're going to go in the direction of, well, we're going to regulate and create compliance markets for, we're going to create compliance industries that like make it so that Facebook has to, consult with all of these intermediary companies that are going to say whether or not they're in compliance with the general data protection regulation, whether they're in compliance now soon to be with the AI Act, whether they're in compliance with the Digital Services Act. And all of those things creates its own industry, and like within Europe of hundreds of thousands, and if not millions of people. And I'm not being cynical. That's just like a different way to kind of get your piece of the pie of like the tech innovation boom. And so this is, so I guess like you kind of have to see all those pieces coming together. And it's not really as simple as like, is it better? It's certainly a different approach. And I think that the cost is often that the tech gets worse in Europe, and I'm not sure that people notice. It's kind of like what Brendan said. I think that like there's kind of like it's a little bit death by a thousand paper cuts. Like everyone's kind of really worried about it, and then like it gets a little bit worse, but no one kind of notices because you're swimming in it so much. And like, but yeah, I would say that like the information ecosystem I see here is, I think, much worse and different than the one that I get in the United States. But I don't know that anyone cares. And so that's kind of an interesting, it's an interesting kind of trade-off to kind of think about as we're kind of talking about these companies in a global regulatory setting.
Thank you for that. I want to come back to something that both Nate and Brendan alluded to earlier, which is about the difficulty of doing research. Just last week, X changed its terms of service, said if there's a dispute, you're going to have to sue before Elon Musk's favorite judge in a district in Texas. It also said that you can't, I guess you can't like scrape like more than 1 million tweets a day, or I don't know exactly how you measure tweets. It's like when Justice Alito asked how much Facebook weighed if it was a newspaper. I don't know, but how hard is it to do research and to figure out what's going on today? Let me start with you, Brendan, and then come to Nate.
It's significantly worse. This, is an important facet of the companies closing up in the way that we were describing earlier. And I guess I do want to highlight that in 2016, we missed the rise of untrustworthy websites. A lot of the transparency and mechanisms and research efforts arose in an effort to prevent us from being blindsided the same way again. And we're not going to have those same early warning systems this time around. So it is possible that we're all missing something important. I don't know that to be so. I don't think there's something, but we're unfortunately in the realm of Rumsfeldian unknown unknowns here, given what the platforms have done. For folks who don't follow this area closely, Twitter used to be very open to academic research. It was arguably studied too much because it was so easy to collect data from. And that had some downsides, but it meant that the research ecosystem has been devastated by Elon Musk's attempt to find revenue after strip mining the company. So he's put incredible fees on researchers. The kinds of access that researchers regularly had before now cost $40,000+ per month, which is beyond the scope of almost any feasible research budget. My colleagues and I have found ways to still do research on the platform, but they're very costly and they require very elaborate workarounds to all of the things that he's broken or started to charge for. So Twitter, and obviously Twitter is, what's happening on Twitter is an important concern because it has both the re-platforming of all the extremists and white supremacists and everyone else who'd been kicked off the platform before, as well as all these mainstream folks who are still using it as the kind of de facto public forum, in part because of the existing network effects and the number of followers they have there, right? So these two worlds are now intersecting in ways that I don't think people think carefully enough about. Their I continue to be shocked at how many elected Democrats just post on Twitter as if everything is fine, while Elon Musk is making everyone on the platform follow him and then retweeting white supremacist content into their feeds. So we know very little about what's happening there. Meta had a tool called CrowdTangle for transparency. It had many important limitations, but nonetheless helped in the transparency sense. They have a new content library that is supposed to have some better transparency features, but so far it is much less accessible. And so on net, transparency has gone down, at least for now. In the future, it may be better than what CrowdTangle was, but they've taken a major source of transparency offline just before a really consequential election. People, I've heard very negative reports from people trying to use TikTok and their API as well. So I think the research landscape is systematically impoverished. Going back to what Kate was saying in terms of Europe, people are looking to the data access provisions that may be coming online or starting to come online there. So it may be that people are trying to study these questions via European data, but that's going to create a whole set of issues. There's an effort that's been pending for a long time that Nate has done incredible work on to try to create platform data transparency here, but so far I think that's been stuck in a partisan logjam. So in the meantime, we wait and we hope we're not missing something important.
Nate, you're muted.
I think Brendan pretty much covered it. The one thing I would emphasize is what's happening in Europe, because if done right, it could not only be a test case for what we could do here or what could be done around the world, it could potentially lead the platforms to developing international transparency standards that would benefit researchers around the world. And so I think the dream here is that if the Europeans can get this up and running, that it could be a major source of transparency. Um, I sort of worry that we can't wait though. I mean, this has to happen now. I mean, because the platforms are changing so rapidly, and as we move into the kind of AI environment, I think that the nature of these platforms is going to change as well. And so we really need to get researcher access. I'm also worried that the way that the DSA is structured, the researcher access provisions are structured, that it's going to lead to a lot of very narrow research requests in particular countries, as opposed to getting what should be like the main data set that most of us are interested in, which is, who is seeing what, where, and why on the platforms. So just a general exposure data set that people can get a sense of what the what types of content people are seeing, what are they engaging with, and then we can, people can do their bespoke, hate speech on YouTube comments in Bulgaria kind of study also. But got to focus on the larger data set that we know the platforms have, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's important to get a lot of these ex-platform people to be part of this process, so that they can say, look, it's not going to be difficult for the platforms to make available to researchers these large data sets.
Kate?
Yeah, I want to plus one the what Nate was saying about the research and coming out of Europe. I completely agree. I think it's going to be a slow process, which is the most unfortunate part. But the best part about the Digital Services Act is this provision that is going to hopefully allow to set a bar for platforms to have a robust cooperation with scientists and researchers, and to mandate it through law. The one thing that I will kind of, not to get too much into the weeds, but Brendan kind of pointed out, there are problems with all of your data if it doesn't create a global standard, all of your data coming from Europe, that you study these platforms on. It is the sample size is different. They don't collect any type of racial data in Europe. There are lots of things that are really not, and again, I don't want to get too much into the weeds with this stuff, but none of these things are just an out of the box solution to all of this. And it is kind of piece by piece, and we're going to have trade-offs with every solution that we have. But I do think that we have reason to be optimistic. I think there's really good reason to be optimistic about the data provisions coming out of the DSA, and that for sure is the best part of kind of what is very, very broad and not really clear where it's going to go yet, kind of set of laws, and so that is the thing that I think everyone is the most excited about.
Okay, so I want to bring this home by focusing on the short term, and let me just start with what I think is probably not at all that unlikely of a scenario, which is we have a very close election. It's election night. We can't call the race yet because there's a lot of ballots still to be counted, and especially in places like Pennsylvania where they haven't changed their rules on the processing of ballots. So maybe we don't know till Saturday. Donald Trump declares victory when we don't know who's the winner. Are we better off now than we were 4 years ago as in terms of the information environment? What are things going to look like? What should we be looking for? What, if anything, can be done to prepare for that moment? Let me start with you, Nate.
Well, one thing that we haven't discussed, but maybe has been implicit, is the fracturing of the information environment. As we talked about before, with respect to Twitter, that one of the, I think, new features, right, of this information environment is that there's a lot of different platforms, and that no single platform has the power that it may have had 4 years ago. Nevertheless, I do think the agenda setting function of Twitter is, as Brendan said, is quite important, and the kind of relay that it plays between the mainstream media and leaders is quite important.
Still today.
Pardon me?
Still today, you're saying?
Yeah, it does.
Because you used the T word, you didn't call it X, so I'm just making sure you're talking about
X, whatever. Yeah. For the same reason, when Kate says doesn't want to make a meta point, I also don't want to say, well, then there's X, and then you don't know which one platform I'm talking about. but anyway, the fracturing of the media environment is quite important because I think that there is still there's maybe even greater potential for the siloistic kind of behavior that Brendan talked about before, and to the extent that Twitter has become a particular type of platform, you could see some types of activity hived off there that maybe would have been more broadly shared 4 years ago. That's just a hypothesis. But I think that you know we're in a much worse place than we were 4 years ago, just in the sense that all the norms of our politics are disintegrating before our eyes. So January 6th is not like a kind of just a one historical event. It's absolutely central to the way we think about what is allowed, what is permissible, and what tactics people may engage in. And that's both in terms of what they're willing to say online and what incitement might result, but also, I think, the use of platforms to coordinate for offline behavior, because those are the things that I think, we're all very worried about in the post-election period.
Kate?
Yeah, I second very much what Nate said. But I think, what is actually funny is like, this is kind of, I do so many panels, and I know everyone on this panel does panels, but like this about like AI and the future of democracy. And I don't think that the future of democracy is like what we have to, it's how we take what has happened in the last 4 to 8 to 16 years and kind of go forward with that. And that's exactly like, I mean, there is the most threatening thing into my mind are the things that have already happened and that have destroyed kind of a lot of the norms that Nate is talking about, and changing like these information ecosystems. It's not like these hypotheticals of like AI churning out election results that people get duped by in some large number, which will I believe honestly sort itself out. I think it's actually like what individuals do to each other through these platforms, and that's kind of not something that people. That's a tale as old as time, and it's not really one of the things that kind of is like the sexiest thing to talk about. But I sadly think that that's kind of what we're going to have to be dealing with.
It reminds me of Justin Levitt's line that we were hacking ourselves rather than being hacked by someone else. Brendan.
Yeah. Building on what Nate said, I just want to underline the synergy between Twitter X and efforts to overturn the election result as a kind of key mechanism of harm here. You can imagine the so-called Brooks Brother riot type events happening at lots of places, that destabilizing, blocking counts, creating pandemonium, et cetera. We saw efforts to do that last time. They've, certain vote counting centers have been hardened, but we have an incredibly decentralized election system. It's just impossible to do that at scale. There's going to be an amplification system between what's out online and Elon Musk and Donald Trump that will be recirculating stuff very quickly. I would expect Fox News and the TV broadcasters to be very circumspect after the lawsuits, but that can be entirely bypassed. And all that needs to happen is to create a kind of layer of things are out of control, we can't trust the results, et cetera, in order to empower the kinds of partisan allies who stood on the sidelines last time, to pursue the kind of technically legal but democratically illegitimate means of overturning the election that is a far more great risk than a violent coup. So the risk we face this time is not January 6th redux. It is a procedural effort to overturn the result. And that kind of misinformation could be a kind of key mechanism that encourages and enables the elites who would be necessary for Trump allies to overturn the election. So that's really the kind of way in which misinformation to me could be most harmful that evening and in the immediate aftermath.
Well, I can't end on that because that just really bummed me out. So let me go back to Nate and just ask you, what's the defense here? Like why, why should we maybe have some hope that we're not going to see the worst case scenario that Brendan just described?
Well, as you know and have written about, there's something called the election administrator's prayer, which is, oh God, whatever happens, please don't let it be close. And when it's close, then all the fragile sort of underbelly of both the information ecosystem and the electoral system comes to the fore. I actually think there's a chance that it will not be close. I'm not going to tell you who I think is going to win. You might not be happy about it, Rick, but that I think that we may actually have an election which is not as razor thin as the last two have been. The other thing, there are certain things that are much better now than they were 4 years ago. Let's also be clear that 95% or more of people, in terms of their experience in voting, is going to be totally fine and uneventful. All of the ballots in the battleground states are paper ballots. And so there are things, conspiracy theories that people may have had before that I think would be unwarranted here. I think that the state election administrators in the battleground states are actually all very, very competent and good. And I think that they are prepared as much as one can be for a lot of this stuff. You may see, the thing that worries me most, and this is kind of a marriage of all the things that we've just been said, is that aberrant, whether it's violence or dysfunction or sort of small level activities, are going to get blown out of proportion on social media and in the media ecosystem to be seen as a national problem. And I think, look, we will see some problems on election day and perhaps in the counting process, but it's unlikely, I think, to be a systemic problem that will affect hundreds of thousands of votes or something like that. Again, I wouldn't have predicted January 6th either, so I don't want to put too much money down on that. But I think, in all likelihood, the election officials are as prepared as they can be for the kind of problems that a lot of people are forecasting.
Well, that's a better place to end things. So let me thank the three of you, Kate Klonick, Brendan Nyhan, Nate Persily. Great discussion. We appreciate it. And just to remind everyone that you can find the video of this event and all of our Safeguarding Democracy Project events at our website, safeguardingdemocracyproject.org. And I'll also say I didn't schedule any more events for the rest of the semester in the hopes that we won't need them. But in the event that we do, I'm sure I'll be calling on some of these people and others in our Safeguarding Democracy Project toolbox to tell us what's going on. Thank you all, and we will see you again soon. Bye-bye.